I'm with the Shelby Police Department. Obviously, you know your wife has been reported missing.
Yeah.
When's the last time you saw her?
It was about 11:30.
11:30?
Yeah.
Where's your car?
Over here.
You mind if we look in your vehicle?
That'll be fine.
All right.
Yeah.
All right, we'll just take a quick look here. And noticed. Have you been cleaning in here lately, or?
No.
No? Okay.
All right.
Shelby Police Department. I have a young lady who's living here with me. Nobody can find her. No one has seen her. No one has heard from her. She didn't show up for work, and I'm just really concerned.
What's her name?
Gabrielle Clevenger.
Gabe would always come in super early to work, and she never missed a day. So when she didn't show up, everyone kind of knew, like, we all had a pit in our stomach, like something's wrong, like Gabe's not here.
Okay, what's going on?
It's her husband, Alec Blair. He got very violent with her, and she has a bunch of police reports that she's filed. I know that he's had her cornered up on the wall and ends up hitting the wall, put a hole in it while she's standing next to it. So she moved in here, and she filed for an annulment. She's only been married 5 months.
Alec would lock her in a room and wouldn't let her out or break her stuff, and he'd like dump alcohol on her stuff and pee on her stuff. It was scary to think about her being around someone that treated her like that, because like you don't know what else he's capable of.
He has threatened her life over text message, and he showed up here today.
Okay.
So no one has heard from her since he was here.
Okay.
And
Phone number for Alex?
yeah, let me look that up.
I'm sorry, the person you are trying to reach has a voicemail box that has not been set.
If you two could have seats on the other side of the table, I'll be there. I appreciate you guys coming down. So what led you to call us today?
Well, I called today because my son got a hold of me and said, hey, Alec showed up at the house and Gabe left with Alec. So I called the police because I was very concerned.
Okay. And she's been having some problems with threats?
Threats to her life. Some of the things that she was telling me was just very alarming. There has been a lot of things that, as far as text messages, she ended up getting a new phone because he was harassing her. Destroyed her property, everything that she owned. Her animals come up missing. I don't know. I know that she was very scared of him. Very much.
And then at some point you also called Alec or text Alec?
Yes.
Okay.
I just said, hey, this is Lisa. When is the last time you've seen Gabe? He said, I saw her earlier because we were going to do some divorce stuff. We got in an argument about it, and so I left. Then I don't know what else. And I said that I saw her get in your car. Where is she?
Lisa Davis basically bluffed him and lied to him and said, well, I was there, I saw her leave with you. And when he was confronted with that information, he changed his story.
He said, oh, okay, she got in, but that's when we argued and I left without her. And I said, oh, well, she never came back inside. And he said, really, I didn't look back to see. I didn't know where she would have went, honestly. And after I received this text from him, it just alarmed me inside.
Okay, and then, so Gabe, you know her through your son? CJ Higginbotham.
Correct.
And her and Gabe are kind of very good friends.
Very good friends, yes.
Lisa told us that even though Alec and Gabe were still married, CJ had been dating her, and Gabe had confided in him about her relationship with Alec.
All right. Well, is there anything you want to add then at this point? Or?
I just want her back safe. I don't care where she's at. I just pray that she's safe.
CJ confirmed what Lisa herself had seen or received.
He told us that Alec had reached out to him on Facebook and had made some threatening statements to him. He had also told us that Alec had kind of randomly sent naked pictures of Gabe to him.
At this point in time, I was really trying to be optimistic, but if you're dealing with a missing person, time is of the essence. We didn't know for sure what had happened to her or where she was, and we needed to try and speed things up and get answers.
Gabe was a bubbly person. She was just always happy. When I first started working with her, I was very shy, but she was always like a comfort person for me to go and talk to. She definitely tried to see the good in everyone, always giving people chances to be confident in themselves. When I first met Gabe, she would talk highly of Alec, and then it seemed like once they got married, things started to go super wrong. He was super controlling. She was just a beautiful person inside and out, and we just wanted her to be safe and protected from him.
Shelby Police Department.
Hello, I received a call from you guys that I missed.
Who am I speaking with?
Alec Blair.
Okay. I'm calling in regards to a Gabrielle Clevenger. Are you currently with her by chance?
No, I'm at work.
You're not with her at all. Have
No.
you seen her today?
I saw her earlier. I was talking to her because we were going to try to go to the courthouse for divorce stuff, but she didn't want to, so I left.
You're not seeing each other now. You guys are split up.
Yeah.
Do you know of any friends of hers in like Shelby or anybody in Mansfield that she might be in contact with, or whose house she might have gone to?
I honestly have no idea.
Okay. And you don't know where she would have gone?
I don't know anything about that, no.
Okay. So I appreciate your cooperation and everything. If anything comes up, if you could just give us a call back here at the Shelby Police Department.
All right.
He was very cooperative, but for still being married to Gabe, he did not show any type of concern for her well-being. This seemed all very routine to him, which seemed very odd.
Alex said that he dropped Gabe off shortly after leaving the residence in Shelby. However, her phone is pinging essentially at his work.
At that point, Shelby PD responded out to where Mr. Blair works to attempt to make contact with him and figure out what had happened.
I'm John Reed with the Shelby Police Department. Nice to meet you. Obviously, you know your wife has been reported missing.
Yeah.
So, do you have any idea where she could be or anything like that?
Honestly, I don't really know.
Okay. When was the last time you saw her?
It was about 10, 11:30. 11:30, yeah.
11:30. Did you guys get any type of argument or anything when you guys?
We did a little bit. I wasn't trying to argue.
Okay.
Yeah, because I was tired.
All right.
Honestly.
All right. So, where did you pick her up at?
And Shelby, where she was staying.
Shelby. Okay. And so you guys get in the car, and what happened?
We get in the car, you know, she starts trying to argue with me.
About what?
Because I was trying to take her to the courthouse to do like divorce stuff, see what we can do with that. She was just getting mad at me because I wanted to do it right there, and she didn't want to do it.
Okay.
At the time.
All right.
Yeah.
And then, when did she get out of the car?
I've been like, not even too long after. It was about, 11:30?
Where's your car at?
Over here.
All right, you got your keys with you?
Yeah.
You mind if we look in your vehicle?
That'll be fine.
All right. All right. That's all right.
Yeah.
All right.
I got the keys, so we'll just...
All right, we'll just take a quick look here. Was she in the front seat?
Yeah. Okay.
Deputy Frazier and I began looking inside the vehicle. A short time later, Deputy Frazier indicated to me that he saw cleaning product on the floor of the vehicle. And the vehicle appeared to be wiped down quickly.
Have you been cleaning in here lately, or? No? Okay.
Why is there blood in the seat?
You got any weapons or anything on you?
No.
Okay, go ahead and turn around. Why don't we just have a seat in the back of my car? I just wanted to ask you a couple more questions, all right?
After I placed Alec in the back of my cruiser, I walked over to Alec's vehicle and immediately noticed the large amount of blood along the frame of the seat.
Dude, look at the blood.
And in the stitching of the vehicle.
It's all over. It's up in the seat, like he's been cleaning. And see you clean that whole floor, right?
Yeah.
As soon as I saw that bottle, I was like, oh.
Yeah.
Look in there, you can see blood. You can see it right here.
Oh, yeah.
You can see where it's all freshly cleaned.
All right. And noticed.
Yeah. And look at all the grass and mud on it. It's been driving off-road.
Right. All right. We're gonna go over and talk to him just to see if he can be honest, see what's going on. All right. Sorry, it's cold out here. So, I mean, before we make things worse, obviously we're taking it serious.
Right.
I mean, what's going on with all the blood and stuff?
It was honestly my friend. Bloody nose.
All up in the seat crevices and all over the place?
Yeah. He had it really bad yesterday.
It is very clear that that was not the case. There was more blood in the vehicle than what would be consistent with a nosebleed. I think he was in such panic mode that he couldn't think of anything to say other than things that made no sense.
Okay. Were you off-road at any point in time today?
I did, yeah, because I had to get out from my mom's house.
Okay. All right.
Had to use the yard.
Okay.
A bit.
Did you have anything to do with her?
I didn't have anything to do with her.
Okay. Did you hurt her in any way?
No. I would never touch a woman.
Okay. All right, I'll be with you in a few minutes, all right?
At that point in time, I asked Alec if he would go to the Shelby Police Department to continue to be asked questions about Gabe, and he agreed.
We'll be with you in a few minutes, okay?
All right.
We didn't have a lot of time. We still didn't know where Gabe was. There was the possibility that she was somewhere alive but harmed. So we wanted to get in there and get as much information out of Alec as we could, as fast as we could.
How you doing, man?
Good.
Sorry to keep you waiting.
Oh, you're
I'm Officer Turner.
Okay.
What's your name?
Alec.
Alec?
Yep.
This is Deputy Dean. So, here, I brought this for you.
Okay, thank you.
So, you know, we want to find her, okay? So, I need your help, and I need to know what you know, okay? So, just kind of give me like start from the beginning, tell me a little bit about yourself, and then your relationship with your wife.
Well, she was telling me that, she wasn't happy because a lot of stuff had to do with me. So I would have anger issues from childhood and parents divorced and stressed. I would if my anger, I would punch the wall or maybe throw something.
Okay.
That would be my type, like getting out my anger.
Right.
But like beginning of January, I moved out with my mom.
Okay.
And I've been living there ever since.
Okay. And then where was she living? You said you moved out, so did she stay in the trailer?
I know she was staying with somebody else. It was a friend at first that turned into, something else.
Okay. What's this guy's name?
CJ.
Okay. So, have you ever talked to him or met him, or?
I've never met him or talked to him or anything.
You never talked to him on the phone or text him? Okay.
So I knew that he was lying, but you do have to kind of have your poker face on, because I wanted to portray to Alec that I was the good guy, that I was his friend, almost like a therapist.
Did you guys have like an understanding, like we're gonna see other people, or we're separated?
It was hard for me at first.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of got really depressed with everything just because I wasn't ready, and she was basically the first person I fell in love with.
Sure.
So it was just kind of hard for me to get used to it, but as of right now, I know my dad was trying to hook me up with some girl.
Okay.
Yeah, so
when's the last time you saw her?
This morning, actually.
Okay, tell me about that. How'd you see her this morning? Why did you see her this morning?
Well, because I was messaging her on Facebook, because I wanted to go to the courthouse so we can figure out anything with a divorce, how much it's going to cost, all that stuff. And she didn't really want to at first, but I was trying to talk her into it so we can get it all done and over with.
Okay.
And then when I did get her, we went to the car. I started going for a little bit, but she just wanted to try to start arguing. I really wasn't in the mood to argue just because I was tired.
He was smiling, and he showed absolutely no emotions that matched with what he was saying. He seemed happy to talk to us and happy to give us information.
About 10 minutes into that interview, just his demeanor and the way he answered questions and said things, I just immediately felt that something was very wrong and that he had done something to her, and we needed to figure out what it was.
I told her, I was like, I'm not really in the mood to argue right now. I just want to go get this done and go to work. She wanted to continue arguing, and then she told me she wanted to get out of the car, so I just was like, okay. So she got out of the car. It wasn't too far from her house, her boyfriend's house, or whatever.
But I mean, how'd you find out where they lived?
I made a stupid post on Facebook about her. It was just really just me just downplaying her. I was just being dumb.
Yeah.
My anger. And someone messaged me and told me the address of his name.
So you were just asking for information about her, or him, or both?
The post was really just about her.
What would you say? Just trash?
Pretty much, yeah. I was just being stupid. It went in my head. I get angry.
Okay.
If I want to say something, it gets in my head, and I'll just come out with it.
Okay. So, when you picked her up today, what is the argument about when you guys are at this point?
She doesn't like to be around me much anymore because of arguments and my anger towards her, where I would call her stupid names just because my anger would do that to me.
Okay, alright. So, you just, what do you call her?
I'm calling her just, stupid. I'll call her whore or all that stupid stuff.
And you've called her that before?
Yeah, usually when we were together, I would call her that just out of fun. She would laugh when I would do that. But now it's just, this was like me. I was angry.
Okay.
I'm just putting it out.
Okay. And did you pull to the side of the road, or did she jump from the moving vehicle?
I stopped for her on the side of the road.
Just where exactly did you pull over and she got out of the car?
I don't remember what road that is. I'm not too familiar.
Alec had a lot of behavioral characteristics that are indicative of somebody who's very nervous and who may not be telling the truth. I was looking him in the eyes, but he'd avert his gaze, and he'd look down. He had his arms folded, so I could tell he was trying to protect himself from my questions.
At that point in time, I felt like I had a perfect opening. Let's tell him how easily we can prove him a liar. All right, I want to ask you about something else real quick, okay? I mean, you seem like a good guy, being cooperative with us here, so we want to shoot you straight to here and put all our cards on the table, because obviously we want to find her.
Right.
All right? I'm just going to break this down real short and simple, all right? One of our officers from the sheriff's office had a look inside your car, saw what he believed was blood and what looked like blood had been cleaned up. Okay?
Yeah.
Now, I'm also told that you said a friend of yours had been in the car and had a bad bloody nose, and that's where it came from.
Yeah.
Is all that accurate?
Yeah.
Okay. Here's the deal. You need to be honest with us about this. All right?
Yeah.
Because we can DNA test that blood.
Right.
We can verify that it's hers and not this friend.
Right.
Okay? We can also subpoena all your phone records and find out if you have been in contact with this CJ or her or whatever it is you've said to them. Okay? They also did a ping on her cell phone, and it pinged off a cell tower not too far from where you work at.
Oh, really?
I get you guys are going through a bad divorce. Okay?
Right, yeah.
People say things that aren't pretty. We've all done it. All right? It's no... we don't care about that.
Right.
All right? We've all been there, whether anyone wants to admit it or not. All right? The point I'm getting at here is all this stuff here, if you're lying about it, it's extremely easy for us to prove that you're lying about it.
Right.
Because we can test DNA, because we can subpoena phone records.
We were calling him out on his inconsistencies, and then he gave us a little bit more. He was actually telling us that the blood was Gabe's. Unknown to me, my sergeants and the chief of police and a supervisor from the sheriff's department were watching it and realized that the recording had stopped.
So, you drag her up and you back in the car, you sit with them. And what do you do?
Officer Turner, could I talk to you for 1 second?
I was notified that the recording had stopped. I was pretty irritated. It stopped right at that crucial point of the interview where he's really starting to give us more information. I thought we were about to get the full confession. So my job at that point was to go back in and have him kind of retell me everything that he had been telling me.
So I want to back up because I'm still a little confused about what happened.
My body language was intentional. Generally, when somebody has their hands behind their head, they're relaxed, but I was nervous because I was afraid that it had thrown off the flow of the interview, and so I didn't know if he was going to continue talking or not at that point.
So you go to her house this morning and you pick her up. What direction do you turn?
We're just going straight towards where the main road and everything is. Because I was going to go down and get my stuff for work just in case. We were going to be late when we were going to the courthouse.
Okay. All right, so you're going to stop back at your house?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you stop back at your house?
We didn't make it all the way down there. We got to the point, where I did hit her.
Okay.
And then I did turn down where the golf course and everything, and towards that dead end, that's where I left her.
Okay. And then tell me again what you did. I'm just trying to understand.
Like where I hit her?
Yeah.
Went like that.
Okay.
Here.
Alright. She starts bleeding real bad. And that's the blood that's in your car right now.
Right.
It's not this other made-up friend that just had a nosebleed. Okay, it's her blood. We got that. Alright. So, after you hit her, she's bleeding everywhere. Is she immediately unconscious?
Yeah.
You know, generally, one punch will not knock somebody unconscious.
Right.
So, you know, I need to know, was it one punch or was it several punches?
It was a couple of them, yeah.
How many do you think?
I don't know. I just kept kind of just going.
And this is all in the car.
Yeah.
And you're using your right hand. You're going like this.
Yeah, because I was driving with my left.
Okay. All right. So you hit her several times with your fists. Wait, it was your fists, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you hit her with anything else? A club or a bat or?
I had nothing else in the car with me.
Okay. Okay. All right. Down my heads.
That's when I take her out to the cornfield.
Okay. All right. So about what time did you dump her body?
It was about, I think it was about like 12:30.
And what do you do like to check for signs of life?
Her pulse, and then try to check her breathing.
Okay. But she wasn't breathing?
It was kind of hard.
Okay.
Like it was coming out, but it was...
Okay, is it like gurgling? Like blood coming out of her mouth, gurgling sound?
So you don't think there was any gurgling sound now?
And you leave her there?
Yeah.
He was giving us a little bit, but something about his story just didn't add up. It's really apparent that he's hiding more than he's leading on.
Did he just beat her unconscious and left her lay, or was there more to it, and did he kill her before he left? I thought, okay, well, I'm going to tell you what I think happened, what my summary of this is, and you correct me if I'm not right. And I laid it out how it seemed to me at that point in time.
Okay. You realize, while you're being a little more honest with you, it still doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
At the very least, if you were concerned about it, you're mere minutes from Shelby, Shiloh, places with people that you can take her to get help.
Right.
You got phones you can call.
Right.
You could have at least called and then drove off after giving them a location.
Yeah, I should have done that. I know I should have.
Well, here's why I think you didn't. I think she was already dead when you pulled her out of that car and dumped her in the field. And you figured, I don't think anybody was at the house when I picked her up. Nobody probably saw me with her. If I just get rid of her, scrub the car down, there's not going to be enough people or enough information to say, yeah, I was with her this afternoon. You just figured you'd take your chances and hope nobody figured it out.
I don't think she was dead, at least to me. After kind of...
Why don't you think she was dead?
Because I was thinking she was breathing and had the pulse.
Come on, man. You've been doing good opening up and being honest about what happened here. It's time to come full circle here and tell us the last of it. She was dead when she came out of that car, wasn't she?
She wasn't dead at all.
She wasn't dead at all. But this is at 12:30.
Right.
And mind you, we're talking over a 12-hour time lapse here now. We're talking. Okay? Today it was rainy. It was cold.
Right.
It was foggy. She's got more than a fair chance of freezing to death before anybody finds her. But you see where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
In my mind, I'm thinking, okay, maybe there's a chance she is still alive. If there was the slightest chance at that point in time, the highest priority needs to be, where is she at? We need to get to her and help her before the situation becomes worse.
So Alex, we'll come back here to the main point. Where did you leave her? Now, I need to know the road and the street, because I know you don't. This whole, like, I'm dumb, I don't know the streets, that's bull. You tell me what road you were on, because we need to go find her right now. Where is her body? Show me on that map.
Be that cornfield, out in the middle of the cornfield, that dead end.
Right there.
Yeah.
Okay. Draw where her body is.
And in the cornfield down here. If I had to guess, it would probably be more towards the end of it.
Oh, so you drug her quite a ways.
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll do one thing at a time. Okay? Just spread your legs for me a little bit.
He's our easiest avenue to being able to find her quickly. So he was secured in a cruiser at that point in time, and several of us hit the road with basically the intention of, okay, show us. Where is she?
You're familiar with the golf course, correct? And the main building of the golf course would have been on your left-hand side.
Yeah, that's right.
And you continued coming northbound. That's
Yeah.
northbound.
That's all the cornfield
Okay.
out there.
Is that where you put her, or was it further up?
It would have been. All right, man. He said it was in a field.
You have the obvious challenges of the weather and your visibility. You can't see much. It's cold. You don't want to accidentally contaminate a crime scene by stumbling through it. You want to find what you're looking for, but you don't want to mess up what you're looking for either.
You know, when he was describing it to me, he made it sound like he took her on the other side of the field. So I'm thinking like back along that tree line there. I'll walk down there.
I had separated off from the rest of the officers that were with me. Shit. And I kind of went down into a ditch. I just kind of was scanning with my flashlight, and then I found her.
We did discover Miss Clevenger's body. And at that point in time, she was deceased. Her body was turned over, and one of the first things I noticed was that she had a wound in the side of her neck, as if it had been cut. And I could also see there appeared to be cut marks in the jacket that she was wearing. So that immediately led me to the conclusion that she had been stabbed to death. It's just horrible that it has to come to that. We've gone from checking the welfare of someone, and now this is what it's come to.
When they found Gabe, I just lost it. Like, we all knew something bad happened, but we weren't sure what had happened. I would always say I love her, but the last time I saw her, I didn't get to say it, and it... Sorry. But I still think about that I didn't get to say I love her the last day I seen her.
We cordoned off the area, and the state crime lab came in. We learned that she had been stabbed 14 times. It explained the amount of blood that we found in the car. It kind of helped paint a more clearer picture of what actually happened.
Obviously, Alec wasn't truthful about the manner in which she was killed. This killing was a lot more brutal than what he let it on to be in the first place. We did find in a trash can out in front of the house a bloody knife and rag. And there were other bloody clothes that were found in Alec Blair's bedroom.
Small backpack appears to have blood on it.
Miss Clevenger's phone was found in a bag of personal possessions belonging to her. So the next step is we're going to go back to him, and we want him to say, yeah, this is what I did, this is where I did it.
We don't want shades of gray. We want the complete truth, and we want the puzzle completed for us.
It's essential to at least try and get some sort of answer and closure so that can be given to, family at a later time.
You don't want a defense attorney to come back at it and pick your case apart and say, well, he said that he just beat her and smothered her. It couldn't have been him. He didn't even tell you how she died. So we needed him to tell us what happened and that closes the case.
Seat the blue chair there, Alec. I spoke to you a few hours ago.
Oh, yeah.
Checked with me with Wilson County Sheriff's Office. This is Sergeant Eichinger. In short, the reason why we're here right now is have a few follow-up questions, just things we'd like to ask you, get clarified. Okay. You told me that when you initially struck Gage, you lost consciousness. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. How many hits did it take to get her to go unconscious, approximately?
I couldn't tell, how many I was doing.
And how much was she bleeding from all that?
She was bleeding pretty heavy.
From where, like her face?
Yeah.
Okay. So, one last big piece of the puzzle here. You're not being honest about the manner in which she was killed.
Right.
So you agree with me, we're not being honest about that.
Yeah.
We need to get this out in the air here, okay? We can't get closure on any of this without truth.
Yeah.
All right? How did you kill her? What happened between you and Gabe Clevenger yesterday afternoon when you went to pick her up at her house?
Just picked her up, went to my house on Taylortown, where I was going to grab my lunch and stuff. Went up to get my headphones, and I grabbed this pocket knife and went back outside. Got back in the car, and I don't know what got into me to do anything. I just remember flash from my eyes, and I was angry with something she was telling me.
Okay. What set it off at that particular moment in time that things just went 0 to 100?
I mean, I was asking her stuff, but I probably shouldn't have asked her. There was some personal stuff between what they were doing.
Okay. That was her answers and responses to this that got you upset?
Yeah.
Did you pick up that knife and go out there with the intention that you were going to kill her when you got back to the driveway?
I don't know. I just picked it up, and I didn't want to do anything, honestly, to her at all. But then, when she was answering the questions I was trying to give to her, it just kind of blacked out, and I decided contemplating, honestly, with that.
Contemplating hurting her?
Yeah. And I don't really, I don't know why that was going through my head.
So would it be fair to say you were contemplating it, and then after she starts getting under your skin with the answers to your questions, that's what made the decision that you were going to...
Yeah.
Okay. This pocket knife you had, did you stab her with it?
Yeah.
Okay, how many times did you stab her with it?
Honestly, I couldn't tell you how many times. That's when I kind of blacked out.
Did you slash her throat with it?
No. No, I didn't get to her throat in any way.
Remember, man,
Right.
I stay here, we can't have any closure.
Right.
Alright? I know she's got a hole in her neck.
Really? I didn't get near her throat at all. Honestly, don't remember ever actually getting to that point. I may have hit it, not knowing I did, but from what I can remember, I never touched her throat.
I'm asking for clarification here.
Yeah.
So is it possible you may have done that and just not remembered it because you were in such a blind rage?
Probably, yeah.
Okay. Did you stab her until she was dead?
Yeah.
Okay. What did you do with the knife and the rags that you used to clean up?
The knife and the rag, I'm pretty sure I put it in the trash.
Okay. Do you have anything else you'd like to add to your statement, Mr. Blair, before we conclude?
Not that I can think of.
This is the culmination of everything we've had so far. We've got him to confirm it with the magic words, "I did it, I stabbed her to death." He's going to be an old man by the time he's even eligible for parole. He is off the streets and out of everybody's lives.
I was happy that we came to the resolution of the case we did, but at the end of the day, it's still a tragedy that a young woman who had her whole life ahead of her was just viciously murdered. I think that Gabe was a very loving person, that she was a good friend and a good daughter, a good sister, that she lived her life to the fullest and that she really cared about other people and those around her.
When I think of Gabe, I just think of how many people loved her and how many people cared about her. And if Gabe were here right now, I would start by saying I love her. And that we all miss her. And that we're sorry that she had to go through that.
"61 years can erase almost everything. Faces disappear from photographs. Houses are demolished. Streets change names. Witnesses grow old. Memories become fragments. And sometimes, a murder survives only as a thin folder in a police archive, waiting in the dark for someone to open it again. But in Albany, New York, one murder refused to disappear. On September 13th, 1964, 50-year-old Catherine Blackburn was found dead inside her home on Colony Street. What investigators discovered inside that house would shock the city, haunt a family for generations, and leave behind one question that seemed impossible to answer. Who had entered Catherine Blackburn's home, attacked her, and vanished without leaving behind a name? For decades, the answer remained buried. Then, 61 years later, science reached into a grave. And the dead man who had escaped suspicion for most of his life finally gave investigators the one thing they had been waiting for: his DNA. The story began on a September day in 1964, when Albany was a very different city. The world was moving through another era. The technology available to detectives was primitive by modern standards. There were no national DNA databases, no genetic genealogy, no computerized criminal profiles capable of searching millions of records in seconds. A fingerprint might connect a suspect to a scene. A witness might remember a face. A blood type might narrow a possibility. But biological evidence could not yet speak with the precision it can today. Catherine Blackburn was living on Colony Street. She was 50 years old and worked as a supervisor at Mohawk Brush Company. She was separated from her husband, who was working in Japan, and she rented space in her home. In the days before her death, she had been advertising the upstairs apartment for a tenant. Then something changed. The advertisements were canceled. The apartment had been painted. Investigators later believe Catherine may have shown the rental to someone around the time she was killed. That ordinary detail would become one of the most important threads in a case that eventually stretched across 3 generations of investigators. Catherine was supposed to go to work. A coworker came to pick her up, but she did not appear. There was no answer, no movement, no response. Concern turned into alarm. Family members were contacted, and eventually, Catherine's niece, Sandy Carmichael, entered the house. What she found there would remain with her for the rest of her life. Catherine was dead. The scene was violent. Investigators determined that she had been sexually assaulted, beaten, stabbed, and subjected to additional acts of brutality. Her death was caused by massive blood loss. The violence was so extreme that the crime immediately became one of Albany's most disturbing unsolved murders. Police arrived. The house became a crime scene. Every object could matter. Every footprint could matter. Every piece of paper could matter. Every drop of blood could matter. The investigators of 1964 did what their science allowed them to do. They documented the scene. They collected physical evidence. They searched for witnesses. They tried to reconstruct Catherine's final hours, but the killer was gone. There was no suspect waiting at the scene. No confession. No obvious relationship between victim and attacker. No simple motive that could explain the violence. And somewhere inside that house, the person responsible had left behind biological evidence that would remain silent for more than half a century. The case moved forward, but the killer did not emerge. Investigators considered the possibility that Catherine had encountered someone connected to the rental of the upstairs apartment. A piece of paper containing the number 117, matching the house number, became one of the strange details recovered during the investigation. A receipt from Catherine's receipt book and other fragments of evidence were examined. But evidence is only useful when investigators can connect it to a person. In 1964, they did not have the technology to make that connection. The killer had left the scene. Catherine was buried. Her family was left with questions. Albany was left with a mystery. And the case entered the long silence of a cold case. Years passed. 1 decade. Then another. The city changed. Technology changed. Police departments changed. But the file remained. Somewhere inside it were clues collected by detectives who had long since retired or died. Their work had not failed. It had simply reached the limits of its time. The evidence waited for science to catch up, and it would wait for a very long time. By the time the 21st century arrived, the murder of Catherine Blackburn had become history to most people in Albany. But for her family, it was never history. It was an absence, a question without an answer, a violent interruption that had happened decades earlier but never truly ended. Sandy Carmichael, the niece who had discovered Catherine, grew older. The family carried the memory forward. Meanwhile, the physical evidence remained preserved. That detail would become crucial, because a cold case can appear dead while its evidence is still alive. In 2018, Albany Police Detective Melissa Morey encountered Catherine Blackburn's case while working in the department's forensic investigative unit. She opened the file. What she found changed the trajectory of the investigation. The evidence had survived. It had not vanished. It had not been destroyed by time. The original detectives had preserved material that could now be examined with technology they could never have imagined. Morey became interested in the case and began working with Dr. Christina Lane and the cold case analysis program associated with Russell Sage College. The investigation was no longer simply a search through old reports. It became a bridge between generations. The detectives of 1964 had collected the evidence. The investigators of the modern era had new tools, and the question was no longer simply, who might have done this? It became something much more precise. What can the biological evidence tell us now? That distinction mattered. DNA had transformed criminal investigations. A biological trace that once could provide little more than a blood type could now potentially contain an identifying genetic profile. But even DNA does not magically produce a name. Investigators still need to interpret it. They need to establish provenance. They need to rule out contamination. They need to understand how the biological material reached the scene. And in a case 6 decades old, every conclusion must survive scrutiny. The investigators returned to the evidence with that burden in mind. They were not searching for a dramatic story. They were searching for something that could withstand the weight of 61 years. Among the preserved evidence was a handkerchief associated with the crime scene. Biological material recovered from the evidence became central to the renewed investigation. Modern forensic methods allowed investigators to extract and analyze genetic information that detectives in 1964 could not have used. Then came another challenge. A genetic profile without a known comparison is a clue, not a conviction. Investigators needed to determine whose DNA it was. This is where the investigation moved into the world of forensic genetic genealogy and familial connections. Instead of asking a database for a perfect match to a known offender, investigators could examine genetic relationships and work backward through family lines. The process was painstaking. It involved science, records, family structures, and investigative judgment. A genetic clue could point toward a family. A family could point toward individuals. An individual could then be evaluated against the historical evidence. Every step mattered. One wrong branch could send investigators into the wrong direction. But gradually, the investigation narrowed. The name that emerged was Joseph Stanley Nowakowski. He was not a mysterious figure from nowhere. He had a criminal history. His arrests and convictions stretched across decades. He had been involved in burglaries and other offenses, and in 1973 he was convicted in connection with a violent attack on an elderly woman in Schenectady. Yet none of that had solved Catherine Blackburn's murder. In 1964, Nowakowski had not been identified as the killer. He was not the suspect detectives were searching for, and Catherine and Nowakowski were not known to have had a relationship. That fact made the developing theory both disturbing and difficult. If investigators were correct, this may have been a crime committed by strangers. A man entered the life of a woman who did not appear to know him. Violence erupted, and then he disappeared. Nowakowski continued living. Catherine did not. For decades, he remained outside the case. He eventually died in 1998. The man investigators now believed responsible was no longer alive to question. No interrogation was possible. No confession could be obtained. No courtroom confrontation could occur. There was only the evidence, and the evidence had to speak for itself. Investigators, therefore, took another step. They needed a direct DNA comparison. The genetic genealogy work had identified Nowakowski as the likely suspect, but the investigation did not stop there. Authorities wanted confirmation. They needed biological material directly attributable to him. And there was one place where that evidence might still exist: the grave. The decision to exhume a body after nearly 3 decades underground is not a routine investigative act. It is a moment where history becomes physical. On September 15, 2025, 61 years and 1 day after Catherine Blackburn's body was discovered, investigators went to Albany Rural Cemetery. Beneath the ground was Joseph Stanley Nowakowski. He had died in 1998. For most of the years between his death and that September morning, there was no public indication that his name would ever be connected to Catherine Blackburn. Now investigators were standing over his grave. The investigation had crossed an extraordinary distance. From a crime scene in 1964 to a cemetery in 2025. From handwritten reports to advanced DNA analysis. From a victim whose killer had no name to a deceased man whose identity had emerged through genetic evidence. Investigators exhumed the remains and obtained DNA samples, including material from the femur and arm. The samples were sent for testing. Then came the wait. The case had already waited 61 years, but now the waiting was different. The investigators had a specific question. Did the DNA from Nowakowski's remains match the biological evidence preserved from Catherine Blackburn's murder? If it did, the cold case would finally have an answer. If it did not, investigators would have to return to the maze. Weeks passed. Then the result arrived. The DNA matched. The man whose name had been absent from the original investigation was now genetically connected to the evidence from Catherine Blackburn's home. Albany police announced that Joseph Stanley Nowakowski was the man they believed responsible for the 1964 murder. The case that had survived for 6 decades had finally been given an identity. But the answer did not erase the horror of what happened. It did something more complicated. It changed the meaning of every year that had passed. For Catherine's family, The killer was no longer an unknown figure. There was a name, there was a face, there was a history, there was a grave, and there was DNA. Yet there was also a profound frustration. Nowakowski had died 27 years before the identification became public. He could not be arrested. He could not be interrogated. He could not stand before a jury. He could not explain why Catherine was targeted. He could not tell investigators whether he had committed other crimes. He could not reveal what happened during the hours inside that house. The man who had taken the answer with him into the grave had unknowingly left behind something more powerful than a confession: biological evidence. For decades, that evidence had been almost invisible. Then technology learned how to read it. That is the paradox of cold case investigations. The past does not change. The evidence does not change. What changes is the ability to understand it. The detectives of 1964 were not holding a worthless clue. They were holding a clue whose language had not yet been invented. The handkerchief was there. The biological material was there. The crime scene was documented. The questions were there. What was missing was the bridge between evidence and identity. Modern forensic science built that bridge. But the investigation did not depend on science alone. It depended on persistence. In 2018, Maury reopened a file that could easily have remained untouched. Dr. Christina Lane and her students contributed to the renewed analysis. The FBI became involved. Relatives of Nowakowski cooperated with investigators. Prosecutors and police worked through the legal process required to obtain his remains. Each piece had to fit. The DNA had to be reliable. The chain of evidence had to be defensible. The identification had to survive scrutiny. This was not a single technological miracle. It was a chain of human decisions. One detective opened an old file. One researcher saw possibilities in old evidence. Investigators preserved the connection between generations. Relatives cooperated. Authorities obtained a DNA sample. And finally, the laboratory produced the answer. 61 years after Catherine Blackburn's death, the phrase, "unknown killer," could finally be removed from the center of the case. The killer had a name: Joseph Stanley Nowakowski. But there was another disturbing dimension to the identification. His criminal history suggested that the Blackburn murder might not have been an isolated expression of violence. Authorities noted his earlier and later offenses. They also said they wanted his DNA available for comparison with other unsolved cases. That meant the Blackburn investigation could become more than the resolution of one murder. It could potentially become a key to other mysteries, other victims, other families waiting, other evidence sitting in boxes, other names buried in archives. The possibility was both compelling and unsettling, because if Nowakowski had escaped detection once, what else might investigators discover? The answer remained uncertain, but one thing had changed permanently. His DNA now existed as an investigative reference. The man who had once disappeared into the anonymity of history had become a genetic signature. For Catherine Blackburn's family, however, this was never about technology. It was about Catherine. Before she became the subject of a cold case investigation, she was a woman with a job, a home, relatives, routines, plans, and a future she expected to continue. She was 50 years old. She worked. She lived. She interacted with people. She expected to wake up the next morning. Then September 1964 took that future away. Her niece Sandy Carmichael eventually spoke publicly after the identification. Her words carried the weight of 6 decades. She described how evil had entered her aunt's house 61 years earlier and changed their lives forever. She said the family had prayed for the day when they would know. Imagine that passage of time. Imagine being young when a relative is murdered and carrying the question into old age. Imagine watching the calendar turn year after year while the person responsible remains unknown. Imagine seeing detectives retire, watching technology change, hearing about DNA solving other cases, and still wondering whether Catherine's case would ever be one of them. Then, in 2025, the phone rings. The police have a name. The man is dead, but the evidence is real. That moment does not bring Catherine back. Nothing can. It does not undo the violence. It does not erase the trauma of the family. But it closes one door that had remained open for 61 years. And perhaps that is what justice looks like in a cold case. Not always a courtroom. Not always handcuffs. Sometimes it is a name spoken aloud after decades of silence. Sometimes it is a police chief standing before reporters and saying that the evidence has finally identified the man responsible. Sometimes it is a family hearing the answer they thought might never come. The case also exposes something uncomfortable about the mythology of cold cases. People often imagine that unsolved murders disappear because investigators stop caring. The reality can be more complicated. A case may become dormant because technology has reached its limits. A suspect may never enter the original investigative field. Evidence may remain preserved but unreadable. A witness may die. Records may become fragmented. And then decades later, a new investigator asks a simple question: what if we look again? That question changed Catherine Blackburn's case. It transformed an old evidence box into a modern forensic investigation. It transformed a handkerchief into a potential genetic witness. It transformed a cemetery into a source of evidence. And it transformed a dead man into the subject of a posthumous identification. The science itself is extraordinary, but perhaps the most remarkable detail is that the answer was not created in 2025. It was already there. The biological evidence came from the original crime. The new technology did not invent the connection. It revealed it. That distinction matters, because it means the work of the detectives in 1964 still mattered. Their photographs mattered. Their reports mattered. Their evidence collection mattered. Their decision to preserve material mattered. Without that foundation, there might have been nothing for modern science to analyze. The investigation became a relay across generations. One group carried the case as far as it could. Another picked it up decades later. Then another. The finish line moved closer each time. And finally, in 2025, someone crossed it. Yet the story remains unsettling because the killer never answered the most important questions. Why Catherine? Why that house? Why that level of violence? Was the rental advertisement connected to the attack? Did Catherine unknowingly open the door to a stranger? Was Nowakowski looking for a victim, or did the encounter become violent unexpectedly? Investigators have established a genetic connection, but DNA cannot explain motive. It can identify a person. It cannot tell us what was happening inside his mind. That mystery may never be solved, and perhaps that is the final cruelty of the case. The identity of the killer can be known while the reason for the killing remains buried forever. The passage of 61 years changed almost every person connected to Catherine Blackburn's case. The detectives who first walked through her home were gone. The original investigators could never have imagined genetic genealogy. The suspect himself was dead. Catherine's family had aged. The city around Colony Street had changed. But the crime scene evidence remained a silent witness. It waited. The phrase cold case often creates an image of something frozen, something abandoned, something beyond recovery. But Catherine Blackburn's case demonstrates another meaning. Cold does not always mean dead. Sometimes it means waiting. Waiting for a technology. Waiting for a database. Waiting for a detective who is willing to open an old file. Waiting for a relative to cooperate. Waiting for a laboratory to turn a biological trace into a genetic profile. Waiting for the right question. The investigators did not travel backward in time. They brought the evidence forward. That is what made the breakthrough possible. In the final stages, investigators had to be certain. A man was being identified more than 60 years after a murder. He was dead. He could not defend himself. The consequences of a wrongful identification would be permanent, so authorities emphasized confirmation. The exhumation was performed to obtain direct DNA evidence. The resulting sample matched the biological evidence from the crime scene. That additional step transformed a genealogical lead into a forensic identification. The name Joseph Stanley Nowakowski was no longer simply a possibility generated by an investigative theory. His DNA was connected to the evidence. That is why the case could finally be announced as solved. Yet the word solved can be misleading. It suggests completion. It suggests that every question has an answer. In reality, some questions will remain forever. We know the identity investigators attribute to the killer. We know the genetic evidence connecting him to the scene. We know he was not prosecuted because he died decades earlier. But we do not know every thought that passed through his mind. We do not know precisely why he chose Catherine. We do not know whether he had committed other crimes that remain unsolved. And we do not know what Catherine experienced in her final moments. Those gaps are the permanent shadows around the case. But there is another side to that darkness. The case demonstrates that evidence can survive longer than people expect. A biological trace can outlive a suspect. A piece of fabric can outlive a detective. A photograph can outlive an entire generation. A police report can survive long enough for someone with new knowledge to understand what the original investigators were looking at. That is why cold case work remains so important. The passage of time can weaken memory, but it does not necessarily destroy evidence. Sometimes time actually makes new forms of analysis possible. Catherine Blackburn's murder became a case study in that reality. The investigation involved the Albany Police Department, forensic investigators, academic researchers, the FBI, prosecutors, and members of Nowakowski's family. It was collaborative, it was methodical, and it was built on something much less dramatic than a sudden confession. It was built on patience. The kind of patience that does not make headlines for decades. The kind of police work that happens quietly while the world moves on. Then suddenly, one morning, the silence breaks. A press conference. Cameras. Reporters. A photograph of a man who had been dead for 27 years. A photograph of a woman whose family had waited 61 years. And between them, a piece of evidence capable of connecting two lives that should never have intersected. Catherine's niece stood there. The family listened. The police explained. The name was spoken. And somewhere in Albany, a case file that had been open for generations finally received an answer. Not every cold case gets that ending. Many never will. Evidence disappears. Witnesses die. Records are lost. Biological material degrades. Suspects vanish into history. But Catherine's case survived because the evidence survived. The people willing to reopen it survived long enough to pursue it. And science advanced far enough to read what had been invisible before. That combination is rare. It is also a warning. Somewhere in police archives across the country are other boxes, other envelopes, other evidence bags, other fragments collected by detectives who did their best with the tools they had. Inside them may be answers to murders that families still think about every day. The difference between an unsolved case and a solved case may sometimes be one person deciding not to leave the file closed. And that is where the story of Catherine Blackburn becomes larger than one murder. It becomes a story about time itself. In 1964, a killer walked away from a house on Colony Street. He left behind a crime that seemed destined to become one more unsolved tragedy. He lived for decades. He committed other offenses. He eventually died. His grave became ordinary. His name became part of old records. For years, there was nothing to suggest that the past would ever catch him. But the past was still waiting. The evidence was still waiting. 61 years after Catherine's murder, investigators stood over his remains. The grave opened. Science entered. A sample was taken. And the silence ended. There is something almost cinematic about that sequence, but the reality is even more powerful because there was no dramatic chase. No midnight arrest. No suspect running through the streets. The final confrontation happened between a laboratory result and a crime scene preserved for more than half a century. The killer could not escape because there was nowhere left to run. His body was in the ground. His DNA was in the evidence. And the two finally met. That is the strange power of forensic science. It does not care how much time has passed. It does not care whether a suspect has changed his name, moved across state lines, retired, disappeared, or died. DNA can remain a biological signature long after a human life has ended. But even then, science needs investigators to interpret it responsibly. That is why the Blackburn investigation required years of work. The breakthrough was not simply DNA solved it. DNA became the final link in a chain that began with the original detectives in 1964 and continued through investigators in 2018 and beyond. The chain included preserved evidence, modern analysis, genetic genealogy, family research, law enforcement cooperation, and direct confirmation through exhumation. Remove one link, and the answer might never have emerged. The story also raises the uncomfortable question of how many other crimes might be connected to people who were never identified. Albany police indicated that Nowakowski's DNA could potentially be compared with evidence from other unsolved cases. That possibility remains open. A man identified in one murder after his death may become a key to another investigation. Perhaps somewhere another family is still waiting. Perhaps another case file contains biological evidence that has never been matched. Perhaps another name is buried in another cemetery. Those possibilities are part of what makes the Blackburn breakthrough so significant. It does not simply close a door. It may open others. But Catherine's family does not need speculation to understand what happened. They finally know who police believe killed her. They finally know that the mystery was not impossible. It simply required time. The family can finally place a name beside the word killer. They can finally tell younger generations that the question was answered. The wound does not disappear, but uncertainty changes into knowledge. And knowledge, after 61 years, can be its own form of closure. The house where Catherine died may no longer look the same. The city may have changed. The people who knew her may have passed away. But her name remains. Catherine Blackburn, 50 years old, a worker, a relative, a woman whose life was violently taken in 1964. 4 decades, she was remembered primarily through the circumstances of her death. Now the resolution of her case gives another generation a chance to remember something else. She was a person before she was a victim. The murder became famous because of its brutality. The investigation became remarkable because of its longevity. But the human story is simpler. Someone was loved. Someone was lost. A family waited. And finally, someone answered the question. On October 8, 2025, Albany authorities publicly announced the identification. The announcement ended 61 years of uncertainty. It also carried an unusual reality. The suspect was already dead. There would be no trial, no sentencing, no prison cell, no courtroom where the evidence could be presented before a jury. Justice had arrived in a different form. The police could establish the identity. The family could hear the name. The record could be corrected, and the case could move from the category of unsolved to solved. But the absence of a trial leaves the story with an eerie finality. There will never be testimony from Nowakowski. There will never be an explanation from him. There will never be a cross-examination. There will never be a moment when he looks at Catherine's family and answers their questions. The DNA speaks where the man cannot. It is powerful evidence, but it is not a voice. And perhaps that silence is fitting for a case that remains silent for so long. For 61 years, Catherine's killer had no name. Then, suddenly he did. Joseph Stanley Nowakowski, born in 1931, dead since 1998. A man whose life intersected with Catherine's for a brief and catastrophic period in 1964, according to investigators, and whose identity was not connected to the murder until decades after his death. That timeline is difficult to comprehend. Catherine was killed when the world was still decades away from modern DNA profiling. Nowakowski died before genetic genealogy became a powerful investigative tool. The detective who reopened the case did so in an era when technology could extract information from evidence collected long before she entered the police department. The final identification happened in a world where investigators could examine DNA relationships in ways that would have sounded like science fiction in 1964. That is the real arc of the case, not simply murder to solution, but 1964 to 2025, paper files to genetic data, unknown suspect to confirmed identity, grave to laboratory, silence to answer. The case is a reminder that time can be an enemy, but it can also become a strange ally. Technology improves, databases expand, analytical techniques become more sensitive, investigators learn from previous cases. A piece of evidence that once seemed unhelpful can suddenly become decisive. Yet none of that changes what happened to Catherine. The science can explain who. It cannot undo what. It cannot return her to her family. It cannot restore the years that followed her death. It cannot erase the image that her niece carried after discovering her body. It can only tell the truth more clearly than anyone could in 1964. And sometimes, after 61 years, that matters. There is a reason investigators continue to call such cases cold rather than forgotten. The word carries the possibility of heat returning. A new lead, a new test, a new witness, a new technology, a new investigator. The Blackburn case remained dormant, but it never truly disappeared. Its evidence remained preserved. Its questions remained unanswered, and its victim remained identified. That is the essential lesson. Catherine Blackburn was never forgotten by the people who loved her. The case was never completely erased by the police, and the evidence never stopped existing. It was simply waiting for the moment when someone could finally make it speak. In the end, it was not a confession that solved the murder. It was not a dramatic eyewitness revelation. It was not a forgotten photograph suddenly discovered in an attic. It was DNA, a biological signature left behind in 1964 and read decades later. A signal crossing 61 years of history, a connection between a crime scene and a grave. And once the match was established, the mystery changed forever. There is one final image that remains. A cemetery in Albany, a grave opened after 27 years. Investigators standing over the remains of a man who could no longer tell them anything. Somewhere else, evidence from a house on Colony Street, preserved since 1964, was carrying information that had outlived almost everyone connected to the original investigation. Between those two places was the distance of 61 years. The distance between Catherine's final hours and the moment her family learned the identity of the man investigators say killed her. 61 years of unanswered questions. 61 years of anniversaries. 61 years of people growing older while one name remained missing. Then science closed the distance. Joseph Stanley Nowakowski could not be brought to justice in the conventional sense, but his identity could be established. Catherine could finally be separated from the word unknown. Her family could finally stop asking who. They may never know every detail of why. They may never know what the killer was thinking. They may never know whether other victims exist. But the central mystery that had haunted Albany for generations was finally broken open. A woman was murdered in 1964. Evidence was collected. The case went cold. Decades passed. A detective reopened the file. Researchers joined the investigation. Genetic technology provided a path. Investigators followed it. A suspect emerged. His remains were exhumed. His DNA was tested. The match came back. And the man who had disappeared into history was finally pulled back into the story. That is the final twist of the Catherine Blackburn case. The killer did not return. The evidence did. He did not confess. His DNA answered. He did not walk into a police station. Investigators went to his grave. He did not face a courtroom. He faced the science of a future he could never have imagined. And Catherine, whose life ended in one of Albany's darkest crimes, finally received something her family had waited 61 years to hear and answer. Not a perfect ending, not a complete explanation, not a chance to reverse time, but an answer. For a cold case, sometimes that is the moment the darkness changes shape. The victim remains gone. The family still carries the loss. The past remains brutal, but the unknown becomes known. The file is no longer a question mark. The evidence has spoken. The name has been recorded. And after 61 years, the silence surrounding Catherine Blackburn finally has a crack in it. Somewhere in Albany, the streets continue as they always have. Cars pass. People go to work. Houses stand where other houses once stood. New generations live ordinary lives without knowing what happened there in 1964. But buried inside the history of that city is the story of a woman whose murder refused to disappear. A case that survived detectives, decades, technology, and death. A case that waited until science could finally read the clue that had been there all along. 61 years ago, Catherine Blackburn lost her life. 61 years later, investigators found the man they say took it. And the final message of the case is not that every mystery will be solved. It is something more haunting. Some answers can remain buried for decades. Some evidence can sleep for generations. Some names can disappear into graves. But if the evidence survives, the truth may be waiting too. It may be waiting in a file, in a laboratory, in a database, in a family tree, or in a fragment of biological material collected on a September night when no one yet understood what it would someday reveal. Catherine Blackburn's story began with a locked house, a missing woman, and a question that seemed destined to remain unanswered. It ended with a grave opened, a DNA sample tested, and a name finally spoken aloud. 61 years of darkness, one genetic connection, one final answer, and a cold case that, after more than half a century, was no longer cold. The silence did not end with the announcement. It changed. For 61 years, the silence had been the silence of uncertainty. Now it was the silence that follows an answer no one expected to hear in their lifetime. Catherine Blackburn had been murdered in 1964. Her family had lived through decades without knowing who was responsible. Investigators had carried the case through changing generations of technology. And finally, the evidence had pointed to a man who had been dead for 27 years. But the strange thing about a solved cold case is that solving it does not necessarily make the past feel distant. Sometimes it makes the past feel closer. Suddenly, the old photographs matter more. The old reports matter more. The street where Catherine lived becomes more than a location. It becomes the last known landscape of a life that ended violently. Every ordinary detail begins to feel important. The work she did, the people she knew, the rooms inside the house, the plans she had for the future, the advertisements for the apartment, the morning when someone came looking for her because she did not arrive at work, and then the terrible discovery that transformed an ordinary home into a crime scene. For investigators in 1964, the priority was immediate. Find the killer. Protect the evidence. Talk to anyone who might have seen something. Reconstruct the timeline. But investigators did not have the luxury of knowing that the most important clue might remain unreadable for decades. They could not know that a biological trace preserved from that scene would eventually become more valuable than almost anything else they collected. They could not know that future investigators would be able to extract a genetic identity from evidence they could only catalog. They could not know that the suspect they were searching for might one day be identified from his remains. That is what makes the case so unsettling. The answer was not created decades later. It was already present. The future simply learned how to hear it. And the man whose DNA eventually connected him to Catherine's murder had lived an entire life outside that accusation. Joseph Stanley Nowakowski had been arrested and convicted for other crimes. His history included burglary and violence, but none of those records had solved Catherine's murder. Nothing in the original investigation had publicly connected him to her death. That gap lasted for generations. It is impossible to know what happened inside his mind during all those years. Whether he remembered the house on Colony Street, whether he thought about Catherine, whether he ever believed investigators would discover the truth, whether he understood that biological evidence could outlive him. There is no answer. He died in 1998. His death appeared to close the possibility of ever questioning him about Catherine. But death did not destroy the evidence. It only removed the possibility of a confession, and that distinction became critical. Investigators no longer needed him to speak. They needed the evidence to match. Modern forensic genealogy provided a path toward identifying a possible suspect. But genealogy alone was not the final word. It was a direction, a road leading investigators toward a specific individual. The next step required certainty. The remains had to be examined. DNA had to be obtained directly from Nowakowski. The result had to be compared with the biological evidence preserved from the murder. That process turned a theory into a forensic conclusion. The result was a match. 61 years after Catherine Blackburn was killed, the identity of the man investigators believed responsible could finally be announced. The investigation had crossed a line that once seemed impossible to reach. But the discovery also forced investigators to confront a painful reality. There would be no prosecution. There would be no sentencing. The legal system could identify the suspect, but it could not bring him into a courtroom. He was already beyond its reach. For Catherine's family, that meant the answer came without the conventional ending. There was no trial to watch, no verdict to hear, no sentence to witness. There was only the knowledge that the man was dead and that science had finally connected him to the evidence. For families of murder victims, the word closure is often used too easily. Closure suggests that pain has an expiration date. It suggests that once a name is known, the wound closes. Real life rarely works that way. An answer can coexist with grief. A solved murder can remain a tragedy. The identification of Nowakowski could not give Catherine back to the people who loved her. It could not return the years that passed without an explanation. It could not erase the memory of the day her niece discovered her. But it could remove one terrible burden, the burden of not knowing. That burden had lasted longer than many people involved in the original investigation were alive. It had crossed generations. Younger members of the family grew up knowing that somewhere in their family history there was a murder with no answer. They inherited not only Catherine's memory, but the uncertainty surrounding her death. Now the uncertainty had a boundary. Investigators could say who they believed was responsible. They could explain the forensic evidence. They could tell the story of how the case was reopened. And they could show how modern science had accomplished something investigators in 1964 could never have imagined. The case became an example of what happens when old evidence is given new life. That is why cold cases matter. They are not merely old crimes. They are unfinished investigations. Every piece of preserved evidence represents a possibility. Every photograph can contain information that technology has not yet extracted. Every biological trace may carry a genetic signature. Every handwritten report may contain a forgotten observation. Time can make a case harder, but time can also bring tools that did not exist when the crime happened. Catherine's murder survived because the evidence survived. That fact cannot be overstated. If the original investigators had failed to preserve biological material, there might have been no path forward. If the evidence had been lost, damaged, contaminated, or discarded, the modern investigation might never have happened. The detectives of 1964 could not solve the case with DNA, but they preserved the possibility that someone else someday could. In that sense, the investigation was never truly abandoned. It was passed forward. There is another disturbing question that follows Nowakowski's identification. What else might his DNA reveal? Albany investigators indicated that his genetic profile could be useful in examining other unsolved crimes. That possibility changes the scope of the story. One murder has been resolved, but the investigation does not necessarily end there. A suspect with a criminal history, identified decades after his death, raises questions about whether other victims could have crossed his path. Cold cases are often isolated in the public imagination. One victim, one crime, one file. But criminals do not always leave neat boundaries between offenses. A violent offender may appear in multiple jurisdictions. A burglary may connect to an assault may connect to a murder. Evidence collected in one case may eventually provide the key to another. That is why DNA databases and forensic comparisons have become so important. They allow investigators to look beyond the assumptions of the original case. A suspect who was invisible in 1964 may become visible decades later because technology has created new connections. That does not mean every unsolved case will suddenly be solved. It does not mean every genetic lead is correct. It means the investigative landscape has changed. The evidence can now travel farther than the detectives who collected it ever could. Catherine's case demonstrates that transformation with brutal clarity. A murder once trapped inside the boundaries of one Albany neighborhood eventually became a genetic investigation spanning decades. The original crime scene was local. The scientific solution was not. It involved modern forensic methods, genetic relationships, records, and cooperation between investigators and researchers. The murder remained in Albany. The evidence traveled through time. And eventually, the answer came from a grave. There is something deeply unsettling about the fact that the killer's final hiding place was not another city. It was not another country. It was not a false identity. It was death. For decades, death appeared to make the case impossible. Then death became part of the solution. Investigators did not need to find Nowakowski alive. They needed to find his remains. They did not need to hear his voice. They needed his DNA. They did not need him to admit what happened. They needed the genetic evidence to establish the connection. That is an entirely different kind of interrogation. The questions were asked by science. The answers came from biology. The body that could no longer speak still contained information. And that information could be compared against evidence preserved from a murder scene more than half a century earlier. The result was extraordinary. A man who had escaped identification during his lifetime could no longer escape identification after death. His grave had become part of the investigation. His remains became evidence. His genetic profile became the final link. The irony is almost impossible to miss. For 61 years, Catherine Blackburn's murder was a story without an ending. Now it has an ending without a trial. The investigation can name the suspect. History can record the identification. Her family can finally know. But the courtroom will remain empty. The chair where the defendant might have sat will never be occupied. The questions that could have been asked will remain unanswered. That is the boundary of what science can do. DNA can tell investigators who contributed biological material. It cannot reconstruct every thought. It cannot reveal motive with certainty. It cannot restore lost memories. It cannot tell Catherine's family exactly what happened in every moment of that terrible night. It can establish a connection. It can transform uncertainty into evidence. It can identify, but it cannot speak for the dead. And perhaps that is why Catherine's name matters so much, because when a case remains unsolved for decades, the victim can slowly become overshadowed by the mystery. Headlines focus on the unknown killer. Documentaries focus on the investigation. Police focus on the evidence. The public remembers the unanswered question, but at the center of all of it is the person who lost everything. Catherine was not a cold case. She was a woman. She had a job. She had family. She had a home. She had a life that existed before the crime. The murder reduced that life to a date and a crime scene in the public record. Solving the case does not change that, but it allows her story to be told differently. She is no longer only the woman whose killer was unknown. She is the woman whose case survived 61 years and was eventually solved through forensic science. Her name becomes the starting point, not merely the ending. Her family no longer has to explain the mystery as an unanswered question. They can explain that investigators finally identified the man responsible. That difference may seem small to someone outside the family. It is not small. It is enormous, because uncertainty has its own kind of pain. It leaves the imagination free to create possibilities. It asks families to live with questions that have no boundaries. Was the killer still alive? Had he been nearby all those years? Had investigators overlooked someone? Could the case ever be solved? Every anniversary could reopen those questions. Every new forensic breakthrough could bring a brief moment of hope, and then silence again. For Catherine's family, that cycle lasted for decades. Then the cycle broke. The police had an answer. The laboratory had an answer. The evidence had an answer. The man responsible was no longer a shadow. He had a name. But the case leaves behind one final lesson that is more powerful than the identification itself. Time does not always destroy the truth. Sometimes it hides it. Sometimes the truth survives in places no one thinks to look. In a box, on a piece of fabric, in a strand of biological material, in a family tree, in a cemetery, in a laboratory freezer, in an old police report written by someone who never lived to see the case solved. The truth can survive quietly. It can wait through decades of technological change. It can wait until a detective decides that an old case deserves another look. That is what happened here. And that is why the story of Catherine Blackburn should not end simply with the name Joseph Stanley Nowakowski. The real ending is the realization that the investigation never truly stopped. It changed shape. In 1964, investigators searched streets and interviewed people. In later years, they preserved the case. In the modern era, investigators searched genetic relationships. Then they searched a grave. Each generation used the tools available to it. Each generation carried the case a little farther, until the final distance was crossed. 61 years. That is longer than an entire career. Longer than most investigative technologies remain current. Long enough for a city to change and for the original witnesses to disappear. Yet one piece of evidence remained connected to one woman and one crime. That is why the final result feels almost impossible. It was not impossible. It was simply delayed. The answer was waiting for the right technology, the right investigator, and the right moment. And when those three things finally came together, the cold case changed forever. The streets of Albany continued moving while the investigation slept. People passed through the city without knowing that one of its oldest murder mysteries was still alive inside a police file. Children grew up. Buildings changed. New stories replaced old ones. Catherine's murder became part of the city's forgotten history. But somewhere, evidence remained. Somewhere, her name remained in police records. Somewhere, the people who loved her continued to remember. And somewhere beneath the surface of that ordinary city was the possibility that the truth had never actually disappeared. It had only become inaccessible. Then, decades later, the door opened. A detective looked at the case again. A forensic team examined evidence with modern methods. Genetic analysis produced a direction. Investigators followed the direction. A cemetery became a crime scene again. A grave became evidence. And the DNA comparison delivered the answer. That chain of events is why the case will remain significant long after the headlines fade. It demonstrates the strange relationship between murder and memory. A violent act may happen in seconds. The consequences can last generations. A killer may believe that time will erase what happened. Sometimes time does the opposite. Every passing year creates another layer of records, another technological advance, another opportunity for investigators to revisit what was once impossible. The future can become the enemy of the person who believed the past was buried. For Catherine Blackburn, the future finally reached backward. It reached through 61 years of silence and found the biological evidence waiting there. The man responsible had died. The victim had been gone for generations. But the connection remained. That is the haunting part. Not that DNA solved the case, but that the evidence had been waiting all along. And now, when Catherine Blackburn's name is spoken, there is an answer attached to it. Not every question, not every detail, but the central answer. The killer is no longer unknown. The case is no longer an empty space in Albany's history. The evidence has been interpreted. The suspect has been identified. The family has heard the truth. 61 years of uncertainty have been replaced by a conclusion that arrived far too late, but still arrived. And somewhere inside that conclusion is the reminder that a cold case is never just an old story. It is a promise that evidence will be remembered, that victims will not become statistics, that unanswered questions may still have answers, that a person can disappear from the world without disappearing from the evidence. Catherine Blackburn disappeared from the world in 1964. But her case remained, her evidence remained, her name remained, and eventually the science caught up. The killer was dead. The DNA was not. The decades were gone. The evidence remained. And when investigators finally brought the two together, the mystery that had haunted Albany for more than half a century finally had a name. The most haunting part of a solved murder is sometimes not the answer. It is everything the answer cannot explain. In Catherine Blackburn's case, investigators could finally identify the man whose DNA was linked to the evidence. But they could not sit across from him. They could not ask where he had been before entering Catherine's home. They could not ask what he wanted. They could not ask why the violence became so extreme. They could not ask whether he had planned the attack, or whether something inside the house changed the course of events. Joseph Stanley Nowakowski was dead. His voice was gone. His explanations were gone. What remained was evidence. And evidence has its own language. It speaks in patterns, in probabilities, in genetic markers, in physical traces. It does not offer emotion. It does not apologize. It does not explain. It connects. In this case, that connection reached backward more than 6 decades. It began with biological evidence recovered from the crime scene and eventually led investigators to a man whose remains were buried at Albany Rural Cemetery. The exhumation was not the beginning of the investigation. It was the final confirmation of a trail that had taken years to build. That trail had begun long before the grave was opened. It began when investigators returned to Catherine's case and asked whether the evidence could still yield something modern science had not been able to see in 1964. The first challenge was not identifying Nowakowski. The first challenge was finding a usable genetic profile. That distinction matters. DNA does not simply appear as a name. Investigators need biological material. They need enough of it. They need to determine whether it is suitable for analysis. And in an old case, the material may have been exposed to decades of storage, handling, and degradation. The evidence must be approached carefully. Every test risks consuming some portion of material that can never be replaced. That means investigators have to balance the desire for answers against the need to preserve what remains. Catherine's case had something many cold cases do not have. It had biological evidence preserved from the original investigation. The old detectives had collected it without knowing what future science might do with it. Decades later, that foresight became crucial. Modern forensic testing could examine the material at a level that was unimaginable when Catherine died. Investigators were no longer limited to the crude classifications of blood type and basic serology. They could work with genetic information. They could search for relationships. They could construct possibilities. They could ask whether the unknown biological contributor belonged to a particular family. And eventually, they could narrow the field to one man. The process did not happen overnight. It took years. In 2018, Albany Police Commander Melissa Morey encountered the Blackburn file and became involved in the effort to reopen it. She worked with researchers connected to the cold case program at Russell Sage College. The FBI later became involved in the forensic genetic genealogy process. In 2023, investigators submitted forensic evidence for advanced DNA analysis according to publicly reported details of the investigation. Scientists were able to develop a genetic profile from the old evidence. That profile could then be used to search for familial connections. That was the moment the case changed character. For 60 years, investigators had been asking, who killed Catherine Blackburn? Now they were asking a different question. Whose family does this DNA belong to? It was a completely different investigative strategy. The killer did not need to be sitting inside a criminal database. He did not need to have been arrested for the Blackburn murder. He did not even need to be alive. His relatives could potentially provide the path. Genetic genealogy works through relationships. One person's DNA can reveal connections to other people. Those connections can be mapped. Family trees can be constructed. Names can be eliminated. Branches can be followed. And somewhere inside that complicated network, investigators hope to find the person who had left the biological evidence behind in Catherine's home. But a genetic genealogy lead is not the same thing as proof. Investigators still have to do traditional police work. They have to verify identities. They have to examine timelines. They have to determine whether a person could have been in the location. They have to consider alternative explanations. They have to obtain direct comparison samples when possible. And in this case, the possible suspect was already dead. The name that eventually emerged was Joseph Stanley Nowakowski. Born in 1931, he was 33 years old in 1964. He had a criminal history that included burglaries and later violent offenses. Yet there was no indication that investigators at the time had identified him as a suspect in Catherine's murder. Authorities also said there was no evidence that Catherine and Nowakowski knew each other. That detail is important because it changes the emotional geometry of the crime. If they were strangers, then the attack may not have emerged from a conventional personal dispute. There was no established relationship for investigators to follow. No obvious domestic motive. No known friendship that could have turned violent. No documented connection that would naturally place Nowakowski inside Catherine's life. Instead, the evidence suggested that a stranger had entered her world. That possibility had made the original investigation especially difficult. How do you identify a stranger who has no obvious reason to be connected to the victim? You start with the physical evidence. You start with what he left behind. One of the crucial pieces was a handkerchief recovered beneath Catherine's body. Investigators eventually determined that biological material associated with the crime was present on the item. Modern testing produced the genetic information that became central to the case. The object itself was ordinary. That is what makes it so powerful. A simple piece of fabric, something that could have been ignored as insignificant, something that could have been thrown away at the time. Instead, it survived. Decades passed. The city changed. The suspect aged. Catherine's family grew older, but the handkerchief remained part of the evidence. It became a silent witness. It could not identify the killer in 1964, but it could preserve a biological trace long enough for the future to identify him. And that is where the investigation becomes almost impossible to separate from the history of forensic science itself. Catherine was killed in an era before modern DNA profiling. The first successful forensic use of DNA fingerprinting would not occur until decades later. The concept of building a genetic profile from crime scene material was still far beyond what Albany detectives could use. Yet the evidence was already waiting. When investigators returned to it in the 21st century, they were not beginning from nothing. They were opening a door that had been locked by technology. The key had finally been invented. But finding Nowakowski through genetic genealogy was only half the journey. Investigators still needed to know whether the man identified through the genetic trail was actually the source of the biological evidence. That required direct DNA confirmation. And there was only one obvious place to obtain it: his grave. In September 2025, investigators received permission to exhume Nowakowski's remains from Albany Rural Cemetery. The date carried its own strange symbolism. On September 15th, 61 years, and 1 day after Catherine's body had been discovered, investigators gathered at the cemetery. They opened the grave. They recovered biological material from the remains, including samples from the femur and arm. The samples were sent to a laboratory. For those investigators, the moment must have felt surreal. The original crime scene was more than 60 years old. The suspect had been dead for 27 years. Yet the investigation was suddenly active again. A cemetery had become part of a murder investigation. The past had become present. The evidence from Catherine's home was waiting for comparison. The remains of the suspected killer were waiting on the other side of the equation. And the laboratory would determine whether those two pieces of history belonged together. The wait lasted weeks. For Catherine's family, 61 years had already passed. But now the waiting had a different quality. There was a suspect. There was a genetic profile. There was a direct sample. There was a test that could potentially end the mystery. The investigators knew what was at stake. If the DNA did not match, the investigation would have to continue. The genealogy lead would have to be reevaluated. Other possibilities would have to be considered. The case could remain unresolved. But if it matched, the 61-year mystery would finally have a name. Then the result came back. The DNA from Nowakowski's remains matched the biological evidence associated with Catherine Blackburn's murder. There was no dramatic confession, no final interview, no suspect sitting beneath fluorescent lights while detectives waited for him to break. There was only the laboratory result, a genetic comparison, a match, a conclusion powerful enough to transform a case that had survived more than half a century. And suddenly, the name Joseph Stanley Nowakowski was no longer simply the name of a man who had lived in Albany. It became the name investigators associated with the murder of Catherine Blackburn. But the identification also created another question. What had happened to Nowakowski after Catherine's murder? The answer revealed a criminal history that made the discovery even more disturbing. His record included multiple arrests and burglaries. He was convicted in connection with a violent attack on a 74-year-old woman in Schenectady in 1973. That attack involved a hatchet and became one of the most significant crimes in his known history. The implication was chilling. Catherine's murder had not occurred in a vacuum of violence. The man investigators eventually linked to her death had demonstrated violent behavior at other points in his life. Yet none of that had been enough to connect him to Catherine in 1964. The connection had remained invisible. That is the terrifying part of hindsight. Once the answer is known, old facts can suddenly look different. A criminal record becomes more significant. An old arrest becomes more interesting. A previous burglary becomes another piece of a possible pattern. Investigators can look backward and see possibilities that were invisible before. But hindsight must be handled carefully. A criminal history does not prove responsibility for an unrelated murder. Only the evidence connecting Nowakowski to Catherine's case could establish that link. And in 2025, investigators said that link was the DNA. The case also revealed something about the nature of criminal investigation that is often overlooked. The original detectives were not working with the tools investigators have today. They could not search a genetic database. They could not build a family tree from DNA. They could not send an old biological trace for modern sequencing. They could not exhume a suspect and compare his genetic profile with evidence from the crime scene. Yet their work still mattered. Their collection of evidence preserved the possibility of a future breakthrough. That is the hidden architecture of cold cases. One generation gathers evidence. Another preserves it. A third develops new technology. A fourth returns to the file and sees a possibility that previous investigators could not see. The final solution may appear sudden in the headlines. But behind that headline can be decades of invisible work. Catherine's case was not solved in one afternoon. It was built over 61 years. That is why the date 2018 matters. That was when the modern investigation gained momentum. Maury revisited the case. Researchers became involved. Evidence was reevaluated. New forensic possibilities were considered. Eventually, the FBI's forensic genetic genealogy team became part of the effort. The investigation became multidisciplinary. Police detectives were no longer working alone. Scientists, genetic genealogists, academic researchers, and federal investigators were contributing different pieces of the puzzle. The process was slow. According to reporting on the investigation, identifying the suspect through the genetic genealogy process took substantial time rather than producing an instant name. That detail is important because popular culture often portrays DNA technology as magic. It is not. A genetic profile does not simply announce, "This is your killer." Investigators have to build relationships. They have to study records. They have to eliminate possibilities. They have to confirm identities. They have to prove that the person connected genetically to the evidence could actually be the person who committed the crime. In Catherine's case, that process ultimately pointed toward Nowakowski. Then investigators went to his grave. And when the DNA matched, 61 years of uncertainty collapsed into one conclusion. But the collapse of uncertainty did not erase the questions. Why Catherine? Why that house? Why that day? Why such violence? Those questions remain. Investigators have said there was no known relationship between Catherine and Nowakowski. That means the most obvious explanation for a murder, personal conflict, was not available. The absence of a known relationship made the crime more frightening, not less. A stranger could enter a person's life for only minutes and leave behind consequences lasting generations. For Catherine's family, the discovery did not provide every answer. But it gave them something they had been denied for most of their lives: a name. Her niece, Sandy Carmichael, had been the person who discovered Catherine's body in 1964. Decades later, she stood before reporters and spoke about the day when evil entered her aunt's house and changed their lives. She said the family had prayed for the day when the case would be resolved. Think about what that means. 61 years. Most people never live that long. A murder investigation can outlive marriages, careers, political eras, entire generations. A child who hears about a murder as a young person can become an elderly adult before the answer arrives. That is what happened here. Catherine's niece was no longer the same woman who walked into that house in 1964. She was 81 when the identification was announced. The case had followed her through an entire lifetime. And then, one morning, it was no longer unknown. There is something profoundly human about that moment. Behind all the science is a family that waited. Behind the genetic profile is a woman who lost her life. Behind the exhumation is a man who escaped the possibility of prosecution because he died decades earlier. Behind the laboratory result is a city remembering a crime it had nearly forgotten. The headline says the case was solved. But the family knows the truth is more complicated. The case was solved. The loss was not. The years were not. The memory was not. And the unanswered questions about Catherine's final moments may never disappear. Still, one question that had dominated the family for 61 years was finally gone. Who killed Catherine Blackburn? Investigators now had an answer. Joseph Stanley Nowakowski. The name had crossed the distance between two worlds. From an old police file to a modern laboratory. From a grave to a crime scene. From 1964 to 2025. And in that single connection, a murder that had once seemed destined to remain unsolved finally became a case with an identified perpetrator. But the strangest thing about the entire investigation was not that science found the killer. It was that the killer had been carrying the evidence with him all along. He carried it through decades. He carried it through arrests, through prison, through freedom, through ordinary years, through aging, through death. And then, without knowing it, he left that evidence behind in the only place where investigators could still reach him: the grave. For 27 years, Joseph Nowakowski had been buried beneath the ground. But the investigation had never buried the evidence. And when modern science finally connected the two, the silence of 61 years was broken. The grave had given investigators what the living suspect never could: a genetic answer. But even after the match, the case refused to become simple. Because a name can solve the identity of a killer without solving the mystery of a murder. The laboratory could say that the biological evidence was connected to Joseph Stanley Nowakowski. It could not reconstruct the final hours of Catherine Blackburn. It could not tell investigators what happened inside the house minute by minute. It could not explain the decisions that brought two lives together on that September day in 1964. And it could not tell Catherine's family why their loved one had been chosen. Those questions are the shadows left behind after the science has done its work. The public often imagines that when a cold case is solved, everything suddenly becomes clear. The detectives find the suspect confesses, the courtroom delivers a verdict, the family watches justice unfold, then the story ends. Catherine Blackburn's story did not end that way. There was no confession. There was no arrest. There was no courtroom. There was a dead suspect, a preserved piece of evidence, and a DNA match separated by 61 years. That was enough to identify the man investigators believe responsible. But it was not enough to give the family every answer they had spent decades waiting for. And that distinction is important, because the most powerful evidence in the case was also the quietest. DNA does not scream. It does not point a finger. It does not tell a story in words. It simply carries information. A genetic profile can sit inside an evidence bag for decades, completely silent to the people around it. It does not age in the same way a witness does. It does not forget. It does not suddenly remember something differently. It does not change its story because 60 years have passed. It waits. That was what happened with the evidence from Catherine's murder. In 1964, investigators could preserve it. In the decades that followed, they could protect it. But they could not fully understand what it contained. Then modern science changed the equation. The evidence could finally be read. And once it could be read, investigators could begin tracing the biological connection backward through time. That is where forensic genetic genealogy transformed the case. The technique is powerful because it does not require a perfect match in an existing criminal database. Instead, investigators can sometimes use genetic relationships to locate distant relatives and construct family connections. The process can be painstaking. A genetic profile may point toward a broad family network rather than a single individual. Researchers must build trees, examine records, compare generations, eliminate people, verify ages, verify locations, verify circumstances. The result is not a magical answer. It is a direction. And directions can lead investigators into unexpected places. In Catherine's case, that direction ultimately pointed toward Joseph Stanley Nowakowski, a man who had lived in Albany, a man with a criminal history, a man who had been convicted of violent conduct in another case, a man who died in 1998, a man who had never been publicly identified as Catherine Blackburn's killer during his lifetime, and a man whose remains were eventually exhumed so investigators could obtain the direct comparison they needed. That sequence is extraordinary because every step depended on the one before it. Without the old evidence, there would have been no DNA. Without DNA, there would have been no genetic genealogy. Without the genealogy, there might have been no Nowakowski. Without Nowakowski's remains, there would have been no direct confirmation. And without the confirmation, investigators could not make the final identification with the same degree of certainty. One link led to another, and the chain stretched across 6 decades. It is easy to look at the final announcement and imagine that the case was solved in a single dramatic breakthrough. But the reality was slower, more technical, more uncertain, more human. There were years when investigators had nothing new to announce. There were periods when the case remained exactly where it had been for decades. There were questions about whether the old evidence was still usable. There were questions about whether the DNA could produce a meaningful profile. There were questions about whether the genetic trail would lead anywhere. And there was always the possibility that the investigation would fail again. That possibility is what makes the eventual results so powerful. Because cold case investigators do not know whether the next test will produce an answer. They only know that without trying, there will definitely be no answer. That is why someone has to reopen the file. Someone has to look at the evidence again. Someone has to ask whether a technology that did not exist 60 years ago can change what the evidence means. That someone, in Catherine's case, was Albany detective Melissa Morey. When she encountered the Blackburn case in 2018, the murder was already more than half a century old. For most people, that amount of time would make the case seem almost impossible. For investigators, it made the case different. Not impossible. Different. The question was no longer whether the original detectives had missed something obvious. The question was whether modern science could see something the original detectives never had the ability to see. That question changed everything. The old case file became a laboratory problem. The crime scene became a source of biological data. The suspect pool became a genetic network. And the past became searchable in a way it had never been before. That is the revolution of forensic investigation. A detective in 1964 could search a neighborhood. A detective today can search relationships. A detective in 1964 could ask whether a witness remembered a face. A modern investigator can ask whether DNA points toward an entire family. A detective in 1964 could compare fingerprints. A modern laboratory can analyze genetic markers at extraordinary levels of detail. The tools changed. But the question did not. Who did this? For Catherine's family, that question was not theoretical. It was personal. It had a face. Her niece had discovered Catherine's body. That memory did not fade simply because the investigation stalled. Every year brought another anniversary. Every decade brought another generation. The world changed. The family changed. But Catherine remained frozen at 50. Her final day remained the same. September 13th, 1964. No matter how many years passed, she was still there. 50 years old. Still inside that terrible scene. Still waiting for someone to explain what happened. And then in 2025, the explanation began with a grave. There is something almost unnatural about opening a grave for a murder investigation that began 61 years earlier. The suspect had already lived his entire life. He had already died. He had already been buried. His family had presumably already mourned him. His death certificate had already become part of the public record. But the investigation was not finished. The state still had questions. And those questions reached beneath the earth. Investigators recovered samples from the remains. They sent them for testing. Then they waited. The date of the exhumation carried an eerie coincidence. September 15th, 2025. One day after the 61st anniversary of Catherine Blackburn's discovery. A woman murdered in 1964. A suspected killer exhumed in 2025. The same calendar page, separated by 61 years. It was not something investigators could have planned. It was simply another strange detail in a case already filled with them. And then the laboratory delivered the answer. The DNA matched. The cold case was no longer cold, but there was another question waiting. What happens when a murder is solved after the suspect has died? There's no standard emotional ending. The family does not get the confrontation they may have imagined. The police do not get to place handcuffs on the suspect. Prosecutors do not get to present the evidence in court. A jury does not get to deliberate. The public does not get to hear a verdict. Instead, the investigation ends with a statement. The evidence identifies the man. The man is dead. The case is solved. And the family is left to absorb what that means. For some people, that may feel incomplete. For others, it may feel like a weight has finally been lifted. For Catherine's family, the identification mattered because the unknown had been one of the most painful parts of the tragedy. They had known how she died. They had known where she died. They had known the violence that had taken her life. What they had not known was who was responsible. Now they knew. And sometimes knowing the name is the first step toward changing the way a family remembers a victim. The story no longer has to end with "the killer was never found." It can end with "the killer was identified." That is a profound difference. But the investigation also leaves another legacy. It gives law enforcement the ability to ask whether Nowakowski's DNA might be relevant to other unsolved crimes. That possibility matters. Because if a biological profile can solve one case after 61 years, it can potentially reopen others. A single genetic identity can become an investigative key. It can be compared with evidence from other crime scenes. It can help determine whether cases separated by years or jurisdictions may share a common offender. It can give families answers they may never have expected. That does not mean every case connected to Nowakowski will prove to involve him. It means investigators now have a tool they did not have before. A genetic reference. A name. A starting point. And perhaps somewhere inside an old evidence room, another case is waiting. Another victim. Another family. Another unanswered question. That is the part of the Blackburn investigation that may continue long after the headlines disappear. The identification of Nowakowski may be the end of one investigation. But scientifically, it could become the beginning of another. Because DNA does not only solve the question investigators are asking today. It can create questions they were not asking yesterday. Was this person connected to another crime? Was there another victim? Was another case mistakenly considered unrelated? Did investigators decades ago encounter the same offender without knowing it? Those questions cannot be answered through speculation. They require evidence. And now, investigators have evidence that did not exist in usable form before. The possibility alone changes the historical significance of the Blackburn case. It is no longer only an old murder finally solved. It is an example of what can happen when preservation meets technology. The detectives who worked Catherine's case in 1964 could not see the future. But they preserved a piece of it. That is their legacy. They collected evidence. They documented the scene. They created records. They left behind something that future investigators could build upon. Without that foundation, the modern breakthrough might never have happened. This is why cold cases should not be measured only by the number of years they remain unsolved. The passage of time does not necessarily mean the investigation has failed. Sometimes it means the investigation is waiting for the science to catch up. And science did catch up. Not quickly, not dramatically, but eventually. 61 years later. That number is difficult to comprehend. Imagine 1964. A world of rotary telephones, paper records, film cameras, handwritten notes. A world before the modern internet, before smartphones, before genetic genealogy, before the idea that a tiny biological trace could identify someone decades after a murder. Now move forward to 2025. The evidence from that old house can be transformed into genetic information. A family tree can be constructed. A deceased suspect can be located. A grave can be opened. DNA can be extracted. A laboratory can compare profiles. And a name can emerge. The technology changed completely. The crime did not. Catherine was still dead. The house was still the crime scene. The evidence still came from the same investigation. The only difference was that the world finally had the tools to understand it. That is what makes the story so haunting. The answer was not waiting in some secret location. It was waiting inside evidence investigators already had. The killer did not suddenly reveal himself. Science revealed him. And the revelation came too late for a courtroom, but not too late for the truth. That distinction may be the most important one of all. Because justice is not always a single event. Sometimes it is a process that continues after everyone involved is gone. Sometimes justice is a record corrected. A victim's name cleared from the list of unknown cases. A family finally told the truth. A killer finally identified. A historical mystery finally given an answer. Catherine Blackburn's case now belongs to that category. The crime remains horrific. The loss remains permanent. The unanswered questions about motive may remain forever. But one mystery has been broken. The identity of the man whose DNA was connected to the evidence is known. Joseph Stanley Nowakowski, a name that did not appear at the center of the investigation in 1964. A name that emerged more than 6 decades later. A name connected not by memory, not by rumor, not by confession, but by science. That is why the case will remain unforgettable. Not because the killer was caught in a dramatic chase. He was not. Not because he confessed. He did not. Not because a witness suddenly remembered everything. That did not happen. He was identified because the past had left behind something the future could read. DNA. A biological signature. A microscopic witness. A silent record. And after 61 years, it finally spoke. A silent record that had waited longer than anyone could have imagined. And once it spoke, it changed the meaning of everything that came before it. The old photographs, the handwritten reports, the evidence bags, the interviews, the unanswered questions, the years when nothing happened. All of it suddenly became part of a much larger story. A story about how a murder can remain hidden not because the truth disappeared, but because the world had not yet developed the ability to recognize it. That distinction is crucial. Catherine Blackburn was not forgotten by everyone. Her family remembered. Investigators remembered. The police file remembered. The evidence remembered. What disappeared was the connection between the evidence and the identity of the person responsible. For decades, that connection remained invisible. Then science found it. And once it was found, it could not be unseen. The name Joseph Stanley Nowakowski now sits inside a case that once had no name attached to its killer. But even that name comes with an uncomfortable reality. The man investigators identified cannot tell his side of the story. He cannot challenge the evidence. He cannot explain his movements. He cannot answer the questions that remained unanswered for more than half a century. He is gone. Catherine is gone. The detectives who first investigated the crime are gone. Many of the witnesses are gone. The original world in which this murder occurred is gone. What remains is the evidence. That is why the final chapter of the case feels less like a confrontation and more like an archaeological discovery. Investigators were not chasing a living suspect through the streets of Albany. They were excavating the past, piece by piece, layer by layer, until they reached something that had survived. A genetic signature. And that signature changed the story. It also changed how investigators could look at the original crime scene. In 1964, a piece of evidence might have been described simply as an object. A handkerchief, a piece of fabric, a trace, something collected because investigators believed it might someday matter. Today, that same object can become a source of biological information. The difference is extraordinary. The object does not change. The information we can extract from it does. That is the fundamental lesson of modern cold case investigation. Evidence has a lifespan that can be much longer than the technology available to analyze it. A photograph can outlive the camera that took it. A fingerprint can outlive the detective who lifted it. A biological trace can outlive the person who left it. And in Catherine Blackburn's case, the evidence outlived both the victim and the man investigators eventually identified as her killer. The investigation, therefore, became a race against something no detective could arrest. Time. Time destroys memories. Time changes buildings. Time removes witnesses. Time buries suspects. Time weakens records. But time does not always destroy biological evidence. Sometimes it preserves it. Sometimes it locks it away. Sometimes it protects it from the world until the world becomes capable of understanding it. That is exactly what happened here. The original investigators could not have known what their evidence would become. They were working under the limitations of their era. They did not have the genetic tools available today. They could not imagine a future in which a family relationship could be reconstructed from DNA. They could not imagine investigators opening a grave decades later and comparing the remains of a dead man to biological evidence preserved from the murder. Yet their decisions created the possibility. They collected. They documented. They preserved. And decades later, someone else continued. That continuity is often invisible in crime stories. The public sees the breakthrough. The headline. The name. The phrase, cold case solved. What the public does not always see is the years of work underneath it. The questions that produced nothing. The tests that failed. The evidence that could not be interpreted. The possibilities that had to be discarded. The databases that did not produce an answer. The family members who had to keep waiting. The investigators who had to resist the temptation to declare the case impossible. That is the real anatomy of a cold case breakthrough. It is rarely one moment. It is accumulation. One clue. One report. One genetic profile. One family connection. One investigative decision. One laboratory test. And finally, one result. In Catherine's case, that result arrived more than 6 decades after the crime. That is almost impossible to imagine in human terms. 61 years is long enough for a child to become an adult, then a parent, then a grandparent. Long enough for one generation to inherit memories from another. Long enough for the original crime to become something younger people know only through stories. And yet Catherine's family continued to carry it. That is why the identification mattered. Not because it could reverse history. It could not. Not because it could punish the killer. It could not. But because it could finally answer the question that had followed the family for generations. Who was responsible? The answer was Nowakowski. And suddenly, the unknown had a face. There is a particular cruelty in living with an unknown killer. When a murderer is identified during a normal investigation, the family may still suffer terribly, but there is a person to associate with the crime. There is an arrest photograph, a court appearance, a name in the newspaper, a sentence, a record. With an unsolved murder, there is only a shadow. The killer could be anyone. A stranger. A neighbor. A passing criminal. Someone who had been questioned. Someone who had escaped notice. Someone who might still be alive. That uncertainty can become its own form of imprisonment. Catherine's family lived with that shadow for decades. Now the shadow has a name. But the answer also creates a strange historical question. What would have happened if DNA technology had existed in 1964? Would investigators have identified Nowakowski immediately? Would the case have been solved within days? Would Catherine's family have spent 61 years without an answer? No one can know. But the contrast between those two worlds shows just how dramatically forensic science has changed. In 1964, investigators were working with physical evidence in a world where biological identification was extremely limited. In 2025, investigators could take that same historical evidence and use advanced genetic analysis to create a path toward identification. The crime did not become easier. The evidence became more informative. That difference may explain why some of the oldest murder cases are suddenly becoming solvable. The past is not changing. Our ability to interrogate it is. Every technological advance creates new possibilities. Better DNA analysis, improved databases, forensic genealogy, digital records, geographic information, modern laboratory techniques. Each one gives investigators another way to revisit an old question. And that means a case that seemed hopeless in 1974 may look different in 1994. A case that seemed impossible in 2004 may look different in 2024. The evidence is the same. The questions are the same. But the tools are not. Catherine Blackburn's murder is a dramatic example of that transformation because the final breakthrough required investigators to bridge an extraordinary distance. They had to connect evidence from a 1964 crime scene with the remains of a man who died in 1998. Then they had to establish that the biological material from the two was connected. That is not simply solving an old murder. It is connecting 2 points in history that were never meant to meet. One point was Catherine's final day. The other was Nowakowski's grave. Between them was more than half a century. And DNA became the bridge. The irony is impossible to ignore. A murderer may believe that death ends accountability. In this case, death did not end the investigation. It changed the method. Investigators could no longer question Nowakowski. So they questioned his biology. They could no longer search his home. So they searched his genetic relationships. They could no longer follow his movements. So they followed the evidence he left behind. They could no longer bring him into a police station. So they went to the cemetery. And the grave gave them what they needed. There is something deeply unsettling about that. A man can disappear. A body can be buried. A life can become history. But a biological trace can remain. And if that trace is preserved, it can become a message sent into the future. A message that may take decades to arrive. Catherine's case was that message. The message was simple. This biological material came from someone. That someone belonged to a family. That family led investigators to a man. That man had remains. Those remains produced DNA. The DNA matched. And the case changed forever. But even after the identification, investigators still had to resist the temptation to fill in the gaps with assumptions. That is one of the most important principles in historical investigations. Knowing who is not the same as knowing why. Knowing who contributed biological material is not the same as knowing every detail of the crime. Knowing a suspect's criminal history does not automatically prove involvement in every unsolved offense. Those distinctions matter. They protect the integrity of the investigation. They also protect the memory of the victim. Catherine deserves facts, not speculation. The confirmed genetic connection is powerful. The unanswered questions remain unanswered. And perhaps they always will. Why did Nowakowski enter Catherine's world? Was he looking for a place to stay? Was the apartment advertisement connected to the crime? Was Catherine simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? Did the attack begin as something else? Was there a plan? Was there an opportunity? Was there a motive that investigators never discovered? Those questions are now historical mysteries. The person who could have answered them is gone. And that is one of the permanent limitations of solving a murder after the suspect's death. Science can establish identity. It cannot resurrect memory. It cannot bring back a conversation that never happened. It cannot recreate the exact emotional state of a person who died decades ago. It cannot force a confession from someone who can no longer speak. The laboratory can tell us what the evidence says. It cannot tell us everything that happened. That is why Catherine's case remains haunting even after it was solved. The mystery has narrowed, but it has not disappeared. There is still darkness around the edges. And perhaps that darkness is unavoidable. Every murder leaves questions. Some are answered quickly. Some take years. Some take decades. Some may never be answered. Catherine's case sits somewhere in between. The central identity question has been answered. the deeper questions remain. But after 61 years, even an incomplete answer can be enormous. For a family that has spent generations asking who, the name matters. For investigators who spent years reopening an old file, the DNA match matters. For forensic scientists, the case demonstrates the power of preserving evidence. And for the broader world of criminal investigation, it sends a message. Do not assume old evidence is useless. Do not assume a cold case is dead. Do not assume that because a suspect is dead, the truth died with him. Sometimes the evidence survives. Sometimes the technology catches up. Sometimes the future returns to the past and finds exactly what it was looking for. Catherine Blackburn's case is proof of that. The investigation began with a woman who did not come to work. It moved into a house where investigators discovered a horrifying crime. It became one of Albany's most enduring unsolved murders. Then it disappeared into decades of silence. But silence was not the same as resolution. The evidence remained. The case remained. The family remained. And eventually, a detective opened the file again. That single act began the final chapter. Not a chase. Not a confession. Not a dramatic arrest. A file. An old file. A file that had been waiting for someone to believe that the past might still have something to say. And it did. The past spoke through DNA. It spoke through a family tree. It spoke through a grave. It spoke through laboratory analysis. And finally, it spoke through a name. Joseph Stanley Nowakowski. The man investigators identified as responsible for Catherine Blackburn's murder had been dead for 27 years. But the evidence connecting him to the crime had survived. That is the image that remains. Not the cemetery alone. Not the laboratory alone. Not the old house alone. But the distance between them. A house in 1964. A grave in 2025. And between those 2 points, 61 years of silence. 61 years in which the city moved forward. 61 years in which technology transformed. 61 years in which the family continued living with an absence. 61 years in which the evidence waited. Then the match came back. And suddenly, time itself seemed to collapse. 1964 was no longer ancient history. The crime scene was no longer only an old photograph. The evidence was no longer merely an artifact. The suspect was no longer an unknown figure. The case was alive again. For one brief moment, 6 decades disappeared. The past returned, and Catherine Blackburn's name stood at the center of it. That is why this case will not be remembered simply as another cold case solved by DNA. It will be remembered as a reminder that truth can survive longer than the people who tried to hide it. It can survive longer than the detectives who searched for it. Longer than the suspect who believed the past was behind him. Longer than the technology that once failed to reveal it. Truth can survive inside something as small as a biological trace. And when the right moment arrives, that trace can become louder than 61 years of silence. The killer is dead. The victim is gone. The detectives of 1964 are gone. But the evidence remained. And in the end, that was enough. Enough to identify. Enough to answer. Enough to change the record. Enough to tell Catherine Blackburn's family that the man investigators believe killed her was no longer unknown. The case had waited 61 years. Science did not forget. And neither did Catherine's name.